Darlene is an African, Cherokee, and Irish lesbian Christian woman with a National Baptist, Episcopal, and Metropolitan Community Church spiritual heritage. Okay, just for your information, Metropolitan Community Church goes by MCC. Okay. Having joined MCC in 1976 and being ordained in 1988, she had been pastored in Baltimore, Maryland, Fairfax, Virginia, and in Cape Town, Western Cape, South Africa. Reverend Darlene recently retired after having served for 24 years as a spiritual leader for the global MCC movement, and 19 years supporting communities and nurturing leaders around the world. She has been executive director of the Philadelphia Mayor's Commission on Sexual Minorities and a member of the Commission on Human Relations. She is co-founder of the National Coalition of Black, Lesbian, and Gays. She is chair of the First International Conference for Gay and Lesbian People of Color and president of the Board of Northern Virginia AIDS Ministry. Reverend Darlene attended Ohio State University, Samaritan College, and Lancaster Theological Seminary. She has 4 children, 7 grandchildren, and 7 great-grandchildren. Reverend Darlene and her wife, Reverend Candy Holmes, live in St. Petersburg, Florida, with their canine sons, Joey and Micah. I present to you Reverend Darlene Garner.
I sound old. Just saying. But as we begin, I acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land. This land was not always the beautiful city of Venice. For centuries before the first Europeans found this place, oh God, that's better than mine. This land was occupied by and under the care of what we today call the Calusa and the Seminole, the original peoples of Southwest Florida. I also want to pay my respects to the elders past, present, and future, for they hold the memories, traditions, culture, and hope of the indigenous Americas. We must always remember that under this concrete and this asphalt, this entire city was, is, and always will be traditional indigenous land. And that it is upon their ancient and sacred land that we live, work, pray, and play today. Jean did a fantastic job with the introduction. I didn't realize that there was going to be so much depth to it. But let me tell you a little bit that Jean did not say, or might have alluded to. I'm a 71-year-old Black lesbian, descendant of freed and enslaved Africans, indentured Irish immigrants, and the First Nations of Cherokee and Catawba peoples. Listen to this if you think that's something. My great-great-grandfather on my mother's side was Jefferson Davis, the only president of the Confederate States of America. I was born under the laws of Jim Crow segregation and raised in the midnight hour before the dawning of the Civil Rights Movement. I was in the 2nd grade when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled on Brown versus Board of Education, putting an official, though not actual, end to segregated public schools. When I was around 8 years old, I was a guest at dinner at my pastor's house, and their out-of-town guest that weekend was Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. then went on to lead the National March on Washington when I was 15 years old. My spiritual and religious roots are in the music, mission, and ministry of the historical Black church. When I was 7 years old, I was baptized at Union Grove Baptist Church in Columbus, Ohio, a congregation of the National Baptist Convention, USA. At that point in the history of Union Grove, I was the youngest person ever to be baptized. At 8 years old, I experienced religious homophobia for the very first time. My favorite Sunday school teacher, Miss Marva, was called before the whole church one Sunday morning, publicly shamed and thrown out of the church for being what was then called that way. At 10, I first heard myself being referred to with the N-word. At 15, the school guidance counselor told me that I should aspire to be a secretary or a nurse or maybe a teacher. But no matter what, I had to go to college in order to meet a man to marry, because being a poor Black woman meant that I would never become a corporate executive, a doctor, or a university professor. When I came out years later, I left the Baptist church and found sanctuary in the Episcopal church. Where's Keith? There you are. Unfortunately, they rejected my call to ministry because I was a woman. I eventually found my way to MCC. They ordained me as clergy in 1988, and in 93, elected me to serve among the spiritual leaders of that global denomination. Being in MCC blessed my life in many ways, including the blessings that I have received from traveling internationally, living cross-culturally in different parts of the U.S., as well as in South Africa and Mexico. And so MCC became my spiritual home until I retired from active ministry in 2017. In case you're wondering, I have been heterosexually married twice. And it's from those unions that came my 4 children, and they gave me 7 grandchildren who are in the process of giving me great-grandchildren. And for the last 10 years, I've been happily married to Candy Holmes, the woman who is the love of my life. I want you to know that it was not easy for me to be a Black woman anywhere. Not within the white-dominated culture of the so-called progressive movement, not in the church, nor anywhere else in the United States. So the lens through which I view the world is primarily that of a Black, same-gender loving, female-identified spiritual leader who has been through some stuff, survived it, and continues speaking the truth of her understanding anyway. I've been directly impacted by injustice my entire life. And yet, despite, or perhaps because of, the scars of homophobia, misogyny, and racism that mar my body and spirit, I am grateful for the lessons that I've learned and am still learning. Amen. My task now is to share with you some of my own thoughts and imaginings about racial and ethnic justice, particularly about the gap between the reality of how things are for immigrants, people of color, people who are differently abled, and white people on the one hand, And on the other hand, the dream of how things could be in the beloved community. We'll consider what racism is, how we got into this mess in the first place, and the impact upon all of us when racial and ethnic justice is denied. Finally, we will consider what will be required from the people of this nation, including those in this room, to close that gap so that the beloved community can finally be created. So let us begin. The concept of racial justice can be a difficult thing to understand, and even a more difficult thing to talk about. But if the current events in the United States have taught us anything, it's that this issue is the utmost importance. To understand what racial and ethnic justice is, we must first understand what each of these words means separately. Race or racial is a powerful social construct. Race does not occur naturally. Rather, it is a U.S.-created system that categorizes people based upon their skin color and what you look like in general. Your race could be determined as white or Caucasian, which is the American ideal, or as Black, African American, Hispanic or Latino American, Asian American, Native American, or a mix, but usually with a hyphen. These categories that our society has developed to classify people into groups and then to treat members of those groups as less than the American ideal of being white. However, even though society pushes the idea that someone needs to fit neatly into one group, most people could fit into more than one of these groups. Race is different from ethnicity. Although the two terms are often confused, race is about what you look like. Ethnicity is about, we can say, how you grew up, what you grew up like. It's about your culture. It's about your religion, your language, your shared understanding of the meaning of certain behaviors, such as for those of us who are primarily ethnically of the U.S., most of us have some understanding of what Southern hospitality means, even if we've never lived in the South. That's a culture thing. That's about our shared ethnicity. Justice simply means being fair. So taken together, racial and ethnic justice means fair treatment for people from all races and ethnic groups, not just as a matter of principle, but as a matter of practice. Racial justice means having policies, beliefs, practices, attitudes, and actions that promote fair treatment for all people. Easy, huh? I believe that one of the things that gets in the way of achieving racial and ethnic justice in our day is that most of us are, I'm going to use this word, are ignorant. We don't know no better. As students, we didn't learn the full truth about American or world history in school. There are secrets that have been kept from us. In exploring racial and ethnic justice, we discover one of those hidden truths, that the United States was formed upon and is grounded in the bedrock of white supremacy. The explorers, colonizers, and ever since then, the governments of this country have adopted, developed, and imposed laws, policies, and practices that intentionally demonize, marginalize, destroy, impoverish, dehumanize, and otherwise disadvantage anyone who is not white. Specifically, anyone who is not an able-bodied, cisgendered. By cisgender, I mean someone whose gender identity at birth continues to be lived out throughout one's life, often compared with transgender, where someone's gender identity may be inconsistent with gender identity at birth. So if we're not able-bodied, cisgendered male and white, we are left out. Bring your attention to the screen. When I speak of white supremacy, I'm not necessarily talking about the Klan. White supremacy is an idea. It's an ideological worldview that is based on genocide and colonialism, slavery and capitalism, and war and Orientalism. Orientalism involves a way of seeing the other, including the Arab, that justifies an ongoing system of domination. It includes the West appropriating and patronizing representations of the East, the societies and peoples who inhabit the places of Asia, North Africa, and the Middle East. White power and supremacy is the basis upon which the United States was founded and has continued to be the American worldview held throughout U.S. history. It is the thread running through every aspect of our life in this country. Our institutions, both church and state, and I would even say many of our homes, give form and function to the white cultural values and norms that undergird U.S. society. It determines who has and who has not, who ascends the ladder and who is kept low, whose voice is heard and whose voice is silenced or ignored. It perpetuates the myth that white people are supreme beings, while African Americans are social and intellectual inferiors. Arab Americans are marauding invaders. Asian Americans are perpetual foreigners. Latin Americans are mixed folks tainted by African and Indian inferiority. And Native Americans are vanishing savages. Within this belief, white supremacy dehumanizes people in order to accomplish its own ends. It uses many different strategies for this, including a racial economic strategy that begins in all instances with demonizing people of color. Again, I draw your attention to the screen, where we learn that racial economic strategy dehumanizes the people in a particular way. And when I say the people, people, I mean all the people. It dehumanizes white people in order to consolidate and control resources in the whole society, and to use the race construct to exploit poor whites, as well as people of color and other marginalized groups in society. It dehumanizes African Americans in order to create a large pool of free and cheap labor that can be used to manipulate and control poor white workers as well. It demonizes Asian Americans in order to acquire and control their natural resources, to prevent those resources from being used to invade and conquer free, democratic, Christian society. It dehumanizes Asian Americans in order to keep them outside the protection of the Constitution, in order to exploit their labor and prevent them from acquiring property and resources. It dehumanizes Latin Americans in order to maintain a Spanish colonial model so that social, political, and economic elites are co-opted to participate in exploitation of the masses. And it dehumanizes Native Americans in order to commit genocide and take possession of the land and exploit the resources. Yet in spite of what the ideology of white supremacy would have us believe, the reality is that race, as we currently understand and live it, is almost always a byproduct of the European imagination. According to anthropologist Anhama Cruz, writing for Timeline.com, she says that the origins of race can be traced to the colonization of the Americas. No one was white or black until the colonization process needed ways to differentiate various rights, privileges, social and legal standings between various laborers. Dating back to the first millennium AD, there are records proving that Africans existed in Europe. From about 711 AD to 1492, most of Spain was under Moorish control. The Moors were a nomadic people from North Africa. Consequently, the Spanish colonizers who settled lands outside of Europe did so while harboring prejudice associated with having been controlled by the darker-skinned Moors. But racial categories, as we now know them, had not yet been used to justify the denial of basic rights, which were controlled then through the church. By contrast, Europeans actually knew Africa to be a wealthy, advanced continent in many areas of development and education. When the American colonizers started the Atlantic slave trade, they weren't simply grabbing people out of jungles, as many of us were led to believe. They were targeting well-established kingdoms that had been weakened by internal strife, with citizens who had the skills required to develop the colonial enterprises, including advanced agricultural practices, metallurgy, navigation, and shipbuilding. They were also targeting the mineral resources from the lands themselves. In June of the year 1452, Pope Nicholas V issued the papal bull called Dum Diversas. It authorized King Alfonso V of Portugal to reduce any Saracens, another word for Muslims, to reduce any Saracens and pagans and any other unbelievers to perpetual slavery. This facilitated the Portuguese slave trade from West Africa. Just 3 years later, in 1455, the same pope wrote another bull to King Alfonso. This one is called Romanus Pontifex. As a follow-up to the Dual Diversis, Romanus Pontifex extended to the Catholic nations of Europe, including England, Portugal, and Spain, extended to those nations dominion over discovered lands during the Age of Discovery. Along with sanctifying the seizure of non-Christian lands, it encouraged the enslavement of native, non-Christian peoples in Africa and the New World. Theologian Kelly Brown Douglas wrote in the April 2018 issue of Sojourners magazine that when America's Pilgrim and Puritan forebears fled England, they were intent on carrying with them the myth of their Anglo-Saxon legacy, as well as the power granted to them by these papal bulls. These early arrivals to America saw themselves as descendants of an ancient Anglo-Saxon people, free from the taint of intermarriages, who uniquely possessed high moral values and an instinctive love for freedom, and who were empowered by God to have control over the people and to exploit the resources of the Americas in order to build a nation that was politically, culturally, religiously, and demographically true to their exceptional Anglo-Saxon heritage as Christians. And to them, this was a divine right. It was a divine vision. And they came up with this way of tracing their Anglo-Saxon heritage through the ancient woods of Germany back to the Bible. They considered themselves to be the new Israelites on a godly mission. And central to this mission was building not simply an Anglo-Saxon nation, but a religious nation. One that reflected the morals and virtues of the Christian God, which in their minds meant the ways of their Anglo-Saxon ancestors and the Catholic Church. From the very beginning, then, America's social identity, with its legitimating religious canopy, was Anglo-Saxon. Thomas Jefferson even proposed language for a United States seal that affirmed this belief. As John Adams described it, Jefferson's seal included the words, "the children of Israel in the wilderness," on the one side, and on the other side, pictures of Hengist and Horsa, the Saxon chiefs, for whom they claim the honor of being descended, and whose political principles and form of government we have assumed. Now, that seal was not accepted as the seal of the United States, but one of our founding fathers proposed it, and it was strongly considered. To me, this is further evidence that America's so-called democracy was conceived of as an expression of a biblically ordained Anglo-Saxon mission of white supremacy. When the Puritans and Pilgrims finally got here, though, they came face to face with a huge problem. Anglo-Saxons were not native to the American soil. The people native to American soil were clearly not Anglo-Saxon, and everybody who looked like Anglo-Saxons were not Anglo-Saxon. In 1751, Benjamin Franklin wrote that the number of purely white people in the world is proportionally very small. And in Europe, the Spaniards, Italians, French, Russians, and Swedes are generally of what we call a swarthy complexion. As are the Germans also, the Saxons only excepted. But the Germans with the English make the principal body of white people on the face of the earth. I could wish their numbers were increased. And while we are making this side of our globe reflect a brighter light, why should we, in the sight of superior beings, darken its people? Benjamin Franklin. Most people who came to the Americas from Europe had one thing in their favor. They looked relatively white. And their whiteness made all the difference. To safeguard the Anglo-Saxon vision of a race of culture of whiteness with defined political, religious, and ethnic identities was born. To be white eventually would be to be considered Anglo-Saxon enough. Whiteness became the passport into the exceptional space that was American identity. A passport freely issued to anyone from Europe who appeared to be white. And so once even a non-British European ended their time as an indentured servant, they were also welcomed into whiteness and bestowed with white privilege. As evangelicals were spreading their brand of Christianity in the 18th and 19th centuries, they believed themselves to be also spreading Anglo-Saxonism. Their mission was as much an Anglo-Saxon mission as it was a Christian mission. Converting foreigners, primarily meaning anyone not British, was to them a way to protect the Anglo-Saxon identity of America. Conversion to Christianity was considered the only logical way to produce Anglo-Saxons out of the tired and huddled masses. By linking whiteness and Anglo-Saxonism and godliness, Christianity became complicit in promoting a great America that is equated with white supremacy. Christian Anglo-Saxon whiteness has subsequently served as the criterion, spoken or unspoken, for determining who is a real American and thereby entitled to the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as well as who has the right to cross borders and to occupy certain spaces. Essentially, white supremacy still provides the measure for what it means to be a legitimate citizen of the United States. All of this served to institutionalize European nationalism, anti-indigeneity, racism, wage disparities, and housing discrimination in every country that the Europeans invaded. In short, Europeans brought racism with them wherever they went, including to the Americas. When I speak of In this context, I'm saying that racism is not the same thing as individual race prejudice and bigotry. I believe that all people are racially prejudiced, regardless of one's racial or ethnic identity. Being racially prejudiced is part of the air that we breathe in this country. It is socialized into every person. So racism that I'm talking about here is more than race prejudice. It's more than individual attitudes and actions. Racism is institutional. It's the collective actions of the dominant racial group. Systemic power turns race prejudice into racism. Racial prejudice becomes racism when one's group's racial prejudices are enforced by the system and institutions of a society, giving power and privilege based on race to the group in power, and limiting the power and privilege of the racial groups that are not in power. See, racism is not like the common cold that gets better with time. It's more like a cancer. Its cure requires an accurate diagnosis. Giving it the proper attention and often undergoing some kind of change in behavior so as to maximize the possibility of healing. You see, the perpetuation of racism is not about blame, but about accountability, especially to those who are harmed by our actions. But in the United States, European racism quickly led to the genocide of 95% of the Native American population, removal of the Native Americans from their land, the institution of the reservation systems, and ghettoization of Native peoples. Red and black people, as well as white women, were not granted the right to vote and were not considered to have full legal humanity and standing. From the very beginning, the traditions of separation and oppression became entrenched in our shared culture. Racism did not stop with the emancipation of the enslaved. Early 20th century eugenics movements, the pseudoscientific branch of racism, and Jim Crow laws combined with media technologies to make it possible to perpetuate anti-Black, anti-Native, anti-Asian, anti-Latinx ideas even faster. This country soon became saturated with ideas about racial purity and concepts of inferiority and superiority that were already embedded in our structures. Separate is never equal, and as an economic, educational, and social hierarchy of class blossomed out of racial divisions, we came to presume that people of color are inherently from the lower classes. All people of color live in ghettos, and all people of colors are culturally alien, thus inferior to real and true Americans. To justify the ongoing brutal and dehumanizing institution of slavery in America, its advocates perpetuate the myth of racial difference that claims white people are intellectually and morally superior to African Americans. Under this narrative, Black people's lifelong and nearly inescapable enslavement is defended as most necessary to the well-being of the Negro, instead of being recognized as a crime against humanity. Slavery was, and often today is, justified as an act of kindness through which whites expose their less evolved human property to discipline, hard work, and morality. The formal abolition of slavery did nothing to overcome the harmful ideas created to defend it. Slavery did not end with emancipation and the passage of the 13th Amendment. It merely evolved. In the decades that followed, beliefs in racial hierarchy took new expression. Especially in the Western U.S., Asian Americans were forced from their homes during World War II and relocated against their will to what were essentially American concentration camps. The violence of convict leasing, lynching, and other forms of racial terrorism forced the exodus of millions of Black Americans from the South to the North and West, where the narrative of racial difference manifested in urban ghettos and generational poverty. Racial subordination was codified and enforced by violence in the era of Jim Crow and segregation, as the nation and its leaders allowed Black people to be burdened, beaten, and marginalized throughout the 20th century. Courageous activism in the 1950s and 1960s resulted in progress toward civil rights, at least for African Americans. But the myth of racial inferiority was not eradicated. Celebrating and romanticizing the civil rights movement while downplaying the violent and powerful resistance that activists faced diverted the national spotlight from the work left undone. Leading into the end of the 20th century, this left Americans of color vulnerable to a new era of racial bias and abuse of power, wielded by our contemporary criminal justice system. To this day, the United States has done very little to acknowledge its legacy of genocide, slavery, lynching, and racial segregation. As a result, people of color and non-European immigrants are still being marginalized, disadvantaged, and disproportionately impoverished. Our children are still taken away from us. The criminal justice system is infected with racial bias, and a presumption of guilt and dangerousness has led to unjustified police violence, especially against Black, brown, and transgender people, and a staggering increase in gun ownership by civilians. The majority of voters in this country twice elected President Barack Obama. Some people actually thought that having elected the first U.S. president of African descent meant the arrival of an end to racism in America. I have to tell you, many of us knew better. And now, the immediate sweetness of the 2018 and 2012 elections has been turned into sour wine by his successors' efforts to erase the legacy of the first Black man to rise to the highest office in this land. Now we're experiencing a rise of white nationalism and white supremacy. Since the election of the current President of the United States, white nationalists are no longer only those hooded in sheets. They're now taking to the internet, social media, as well as to the streets, coming out with a vengeance, unhooded and spewing their hatred while waiting waving their Confederate flags. And we ought not fool ourselves. They are also dressing up in suits and ties and pantsuits while sitting in the U.S. presidential cabinet meetings, state legislatures, city councils, school boards, and corporate corner offices. And driven by this racism, same kind of hate, the President of the United States is now using the Muslim community as well as Latino community as his political punching bags, travel bans, the wall, security at the borders, Latino men all being rapists or members of drug cartels. Right here in Florida, in our dear beloved state, in 2017, little known fact, there were 145 anti-Muslim incidents. That makes Florida the 5th highest state in the country, behind California, Texas, New York, and Ohio. More than a third of the incidents involved federal agencies, particularly the FBI and ICE. The United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world, with just 4.4% of the world's population. Its jails and prisons house around 22% of the world's prisoners, at a cost to the taxpayers of more than $75 billion a year. In 2016, about 3 million people were incarcerated in the U.S. That's at least 716 people for every 100,000 of the national population. And more than half of these are African American men. 3 million is a staggering number. It's kind of hard to wrap your head around what 3 million people looks like. So to bring it closer to home, 3 million is the same as the number of people who live in Jacksonville, Miami, Tampa, Orlando, St. Petersburg, Hialeah, Port St. Lucie, and Cape Coral combined. Can you imagine? It's as though everyone in the 8 largest cities in Florida is now in prison. That's how many people are sitting behind bars right now. Racial disparity pervades every stage of the U.S. criminal justice system, from arrest to trial to sentencing. Black people and people of color in this country are imprisoned at more than 5 times the rate of whites. 1 in 10 black children has a parent behind bars, compared with about 1 in 60 white kids. Mass incarceration has had devastating consequences for people of color. At the current rate, 1 in 3 black boys, 1 in 6 Latino boys, and 1 in every 17 white males is projected to go to jail or prison in his lifetime. The overthrowing of Jim Crow laws in 1954 was supposed to end racial segregation. It was supposed to extend civil rights and give access to remedies for those who had been enslaved and their descendants. Yet affirmative action is now essentially over. Segregated housing patterns persist. Black workers with natural hair can be fired from their jobs. And the U.S. Justice Department is redirecting resources of its Civil Rights Division away from protecting the civil rights of minorities and toward investigating and possibly suing universities over admissions policies deemed to have discriminated against white applicants. A new government office has been created to restore federal enforcement of the U.S. laws that protect the fundamental and inalienable rights of so-called conscious and religious freedom. Any guess as to who benefits from those changes? African American citizens were not granted an unencumbered right to vote until the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which prohibited racial discrimination in voting. And that was a sweet thing for people of African descent until the 2013 Supreme Court decision that struck down Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act. Section 4 was the provision that required racially problematic areas of the U.S. to submit any proposed changes to their voting laws to the federal government for approval. And the Supreme Court said no. So now jurisdictions across the nation, racist and non-racist jurisdictions alike, are free to change their voting laws in any way that they want. And the impact, once again, the African American vote is being suppressed. In just the last 4 years alone, over 1,285 black men, women, and children were killed at the hands of militarized police. That translates to the death of at least one person of African descent each and every day. Gun violence is escalating in this country to unprecedented levels. There are nearly 13,000 gun homicides a year in the U.S. 13,000. That's almost 36 people a day, including children and teenagers who are killed by guns on an average day. America's gun homicide rate is more than 25 times the average of other high-income countries. A full 82% of the gun deaths in the entire world take place right here in the good old USA. Police officers killed 1,129 people in 2017. More people died from police violence that year than the total number of U.S. soldiers killed in action around the globe. That number was 21. More people died at the hands of police in 2017 than the number of black people who were lynched in the worst years of Jim Crow. Cops killed more Americans in 2017 than terrorists did. They killed more citizens than airplanes did, than mass shooters did, than Chicago's top gang thugs did. Yet only 12 officers were charged with a crime related to a shooting death of those they were sworn to protect and serve. Black men are 13 times more likely than non-Hispanic white men to be shot and killed with a gun. Black Americans make up just 13-14% of the U.S. population, but are victims of more than half of the gun homicides. Pulse nightclub should have been enough. Parkland should have been Sandy Hook should have been enough. Sutherland Springs, Aurora, San Bernardino should have been enough. But the fact that this list could go on and on and on should be enough. But it's not for the National Rifle Association. And each passing tragedy has been met with inaction by lawmakers who are too cowardly and too beholden to the NRA to act. And this is only just a little bit of what's real in America. Making America great again is not going to get any of us closer to having the beloved community. I believe that the United States can do better than this. Gun ownership, romanticizing the history of this nation, especially the Civil War, homophobia, transphobia, Islamophobia, fear of foreigners, misogyny, voter suppression, and racism are intersectional issues, all grounded in and growing out of white supremacy. Women, immigrants, communities of color, LGBTQ people, the differently abled communities, and all other communities that are vulnerable to discrimination are those most likely to be the victims of white supremacy. In progressive religious circles, you will often hear calls to build the beloved community. But I'm not sure we always appreciate the full historic resonance of that phrase. Many of us attribute it to Martin Luther King. He was quoting somebody else. The term beloved community was coined by the early 20th century American philosopher Josiah Royce. But most of us learned it not from Royce, but from the Reverend Dr. Luther King Jr., who often spoke of the beloved community as his ultimate goal. So whether Royce or King, the beloved community is still an illusion for us. As an early example, after the Montgomery bus boycotts and speaking about the larger movement toward which they were building, Dr. King said, "This is my vision. The end is reconciliation. The end is redemption. The end is the creation of the beloved community. It is this type of spirit and this type of love that can transform opponents into friends. It is this love which will bring about miracles in human hearts." But notice as well what King is not saying. He's not saying what we're accustomed to hearing in our highly competitive society, that the goal is a decisive or even crushing victory over our opponents. For King, building beloved community requires the even harder work of reconciliation, redemption, and being in right relationship, of transforming opponents into friends. As Dr. King said in his 1967 A Christmas Sermon on Peace, "We will not only win freedom for ourselves, we will so appeal to your heart and conscience that we will win you in the process, and our victory will be a double victory." That's what he meant by a love which will bring about miracles in human hearts. Practices like nonviolent activism that breaks open the hearts of your opponents, confronting them with the inherent worth and dignity of peoples and groups they falsely believe to be less than Filipino. According to the King Center, for Dr. King, the beloved community was not a lofty utopian goal to be confused with the rapturous image of the peaceable kingdom in which lions and lambs coexist in idyllic harmony. Rather, the beloved community was for him a realistic, achievable goal that could be attained by a critical mass of people committed to and trained in the philosophy and methods of nonviolence. Dr. King's beloved community is a global vision in which all people can share in the wealth of the earth. In the beloved community, poverty, hunger, and homelessness will not be tolerated because international standards of human decency will not allow it. Racism and all forms of discrimination, bigotry, and prejudice will be replaced by an all-inclusive spirit of kinship. In the beloved community, international disputes will be resolved by peaceful conflict resolution and reconciliation of adversaries instead of military conflict. Love and trust will triumph over fear and hatred. Peace with justice will prevail over war and military conflict. The vision of the beloved community is in many ways a secularized version of what Jesus called the kingdom of God. Close in concept. But too often Jesus is confused with the White Queen from Alice in Wonderland. Christianity, however, is not about believing 6 impossible things before breakfast. Rather, following the way of Jesus is about practicing radical kindness and compassion in our day, just as Jesus did in his day and time. A love that dares to transgress cultural and tribal divisions. From that perspective, I think G.K. Chesterton's view on Christianity applies equally to Dr. King's vision of the beloved community. It has not been tried and found wanting. It has been found difficult and not tried. Recall that for Dr. King, the beloved community was a realistic, achievable goal that could be attained by a critical mass of people committed to and trained in the philosophy and methods of nonviolence. Given the effectiveness we have seen of the practice of nonviolence in the movements led by King, Gandhi, and others, what would it mean to work toward having in this country, in this decade, a critical mass of people committed to and trained in the philosophy and methods of nonviolence? What might it look like if we reallocated even 1% of our nation's significant military budget for teaching nonviolent activism? And then 2% the next year, and 3%. How might such a paradigm shift help us move away from what Dr. King called the 3 greatest threats to building the beloved community? Racism, materialism, and militarism. In our own lives, what would it look like to seek to communicate with one another? Even when we are stressed out, with less harshness and more with nonviolent compassion. The beloved community can be expressed in these ways, in these kinds of ways. The beloved community offers radical hospitality to everyone. It's an inclusive family rather than an exclusive club. It recognizes and honors the image of God in every human being. It exhibits personal authenticity, true respect and validation of others. It's expressed by the recognition and affirmation, not eradication of differences. It listens emotionally, i.e. with the heart. It fosters empathy and compassion for others. It tolerates ambiguity, realizes that sometimes a clear-cut answer is not readily available. It builds increasing levels of trust and works to avoid fear of difference and fear of others. It acknowledges limitations, lack of knowledge or understanding, and seeks to learn. It acknowledges conflict or pain in order to work on difficult issues. It speaks truth in love, always considering ways to be compassionate with one another. It avoids physical aggression and verbal abuse. It resolves conflicts peacefully, without violence, recognizing that peacefully doesn't always mean comfortably for everybody. It releases resentment and bitterness through self-purification, meaning an avoidance of doing internal violence through our spiritual, physical, and psychological care. It focuses energy on removing evil forces and unjust systems, not destroying persons. The beloved community includes having an unyielding persistence and unwavering commitment to justice. It achieves friendship and understanding through negotiation, compromise, or consensus, considering each circumstance to discern which will be most helpful. It righteously opposes and takes direct action against poverty, hunger, and homelessness. It advocates thoroughgoing, extensive neighborhood revitalization without displacement. This also applies to the church, working toward responsible and equitable growth, discipleship, and worship. The beloved community blends faith and action to generate a commitment to defeating injustice, not forgetting that injustice can also be found within the church. It encourages and embraces artistic expressions of faith from diverse perspectives. It fosters dynamic and active spirituality, recognizes that we serve a dynamic God who is not left behind by a changing world or people, and that a passive approach to our spirituality will not work. It gathers together regularly for table fellowship and meets the needs of everyone in the community. It relies on scripture reading, prayer, and corporate worship for inner strength, promotes human rights, and works to create a non-racist society. And it shares power and acknowledges the inescapable network of mutuality among the human family. I invite us to analyze this particular screen. At the top, we see equality, equity, and justice. Our approach to dealing with these issues, I would say the 20th century approach to dealing with these issues, initially was to seek equality. Give everybody a step up that didn't get it. Late 20th century and perhaps even now focuses not on equality but on equity. And in equity we see that depending upon your circumstances, some get a bigger 2-step up, some get 1 step up. They call that equity, so that now at least everybody can see the game, see how the game is played. Look at the third picture. I call that picture justice because the barriers to full inclusion have been eliminated. I don't know if you can see it. It's subtle up here. But under justice, you see the 3 people looking at the game, and they're looking through a chain link fence. Can you tell that chain link fence? It's really important. That's white supremacy. Everybody cannot play the game until all of the barriers are removed. White supremacy is dismantled. Only then can you become a full participant and not only an observer of our society. I know we've come a long way as a nation. The journey's not over yet. It's true that we have moved somewhat from the notions of manifest destiny, genocide, segregation, lynchings, and Jim Crow laws toward pursuing equality for all. Most of us in this room are old enough to remember when the American dream presumed that everyone could be treated as though they were a white man. Then we moved away from equality as our goal and towards seeking equity. We understood equity as a state or quality of being fair and impartial, yet our personal biases kept or keep getting in the way. The barriers were not removed. Once again, we experienced that the pursuit of equity alone leaves a growing number of people in our society unable to enjoy the full benefits of their humanity. I consider all this, all that the country has come through and is going through, to be a continuation of white supremacist notions that will never work well for women, for people of color, or even for most white people, for that matter. I believe that the pursuits of equality and equity ignore the fact that not everyone is or wants to be a white man. Our differences matter. Creation of the beloved community will require us to dismantle this country's foundation of white supremacy in all of its forms, to honor, respect, and value human differences, while simultaneously removing any and all barriers to full participation in society by everyone. What can you do? Well, Albert Einstein once said, insanity is doing the same thing in the same way and getting a different result. I believe that white supremacy continues to exist today, and that the beloved community continues to evade us only because we continue to do what we have always done. Even those of us who consider ourselves to be progressives can sometimes be overwhelmed or even become emotionally, psychologically, or spiritually paralyzed when we learn about all that's going on. But the problem is that once we have come back to ourselves, and we usually do, we go right back to doing the same things we've always done. Usually doing them in the same ways and then blaming somebody else for mounting acts of injustice. If the beloved community is to be achieved, this nation must repent from the sin of white supremacy. This means that each one of us must find the strength, courage, desire, and will to resist white supremacy. We must do this as individuals, as groups of people, as churches, as employers, lawmakers, organizers, organizations, voters, every aspect of a civilized society. It's not enough just to feel angry, guilty, or ashamed, or afraid. It's not enough to get so paralyzed or overwhelmed that your paralysis becomes your excuse for doing nothing. It's not enough just to take it to therapy. It's not enough just to say, I'm sorry, or, well, that was my ancestors, not me. It's surely not enough to play the oppression Olympics as though to prove that your oppression is greater than anyone else's. Those are idle words spoken most often by folks who then immediately return to their privileged position as white people. Now is the time for action and activism. What can you do? You can learn and then teach a fuller truth about our nation's history. You can listen compassionately rather than judgmentally to those who might have had a different kind of life experience in this country than you have had. You can recognize and accept responsibility for how you have benefited from the ways that things are. And then do something new for yourself or for someone else that will move you beyond your own complicity with white supremacy. Here's some ideas, just ideas. Vote. But vote only for issues and candidates that are committed to justice making rather than money making. You can run for office yourself. You can come to understand that your silence is complicity. If you see something, say something. Whenever that something is or might be harmful to you or to someone else, even someone who doesn't look like you. If you don't need a weapon in your line of work, don't buy a gun. And if your activism is limited to pursuing justice only for those of your own identity, it is time that you joined in coalition with others in the struggle of justice for all of us. In pursuit of the beloved community, we must do these things and more. until we have a fully inclusive, transformed society. I believe our society can overcome systemic racism. I believe that every aspect of daily life can reflect full participation and shared power with diverse racial, cultural, and economic groups in determining each community's policies and practices. There can be full participation in decisions that shape government institutions, executive, legislative, and judicial, with inclusion of diverse cultures, lifestyles, and interests. We can live in a society that has a sense of restored community and where mutual sharing prevails. We must come together to imagine this better society and then work together until it's our shared reality. There was a moment when Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. ascended to the mountaintop. From the summit, he cast his eyes out upon a verdant valley and saw something that had never been seen before. He saw what's on the other side of the mountain. He saw the beloved community. As he looked out, he saw a brave new world of cisgender and transgender men and women, young and old, Jew and Gentile, gay and straight, immigrant and native born, of all hues and colors, all living and loving together as equals in beloved community. What a sight it must have been to behold. I believe that Reverend Dr. King's vision was more than just a dream. To me, it was prophecy. A foretelling of what this country could be if only we would find the will and the way to do some things differently. After all, the time is always right to do what is right. So with all this in mind, I close now with a poem by Portia Nelson, after which I would welcome questions, comments, or even pushback to anything that I have said. Chapter 1, I walk down the street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I fall in. I am lost. I am hopeless. It isn't my fault. It takes forever to find a way out. Chapter 2. I walk down the same street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I pretend I don't see it. I fall in again. Can't believe I'm in the same place. But it isn't my fault. It still takes me a long time to get out. Chapter 3. I walk down the same street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I see it's there. I still fall in. It's a habit. My eyes are open. I know where I am. It is my fault. I get out immediately. Chapter 4. I walk down the same street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I walk around it. Chapter 5. I walk down another street. Thank you. I expressions of support. But I was thirsty and had to get some water.
We have microphones on either side. Please limit your questions or comments to be short, because we do have time constraints. Not much at all, actually. And so, no advertising tonight. All right. Thank you very much. We appreciate it very much. And so, who's first? No questions.
Always falling out or something.
As long as you're not falling in a hole.
Well,
Now I'd have to call the city and tell them, no, I'd probably be the one to put the gravel in the hole. Because that happened on my street now, that's how I'm going. Anyways, I think that this series, everyone involved, thank you so much. It's been a wonderful eye-opener, and it is something I hope I can give others to help them. I do volunteer with little kids, and I hope that I can inspire just, at least 5 or 6 of them, because they tell me kinds of things that I'm awestruck by. The other thing is, it saddens me that we have these programs, because oftentimes the people that come are people that recognize what's going on, and it's preaching to the choir. But look at our choir, all the people here. How wonderful is that? And I just hope America keeps getting so much better. It will be wonderful. That's my dream. And this is my church. And so if you want to come on Sunday, that's my advertisement. We have 3 services, one on Saturday at 5.
That just added some more time on the other end, right?
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
I don't know if that was on.
It is.
Thank you so much.
It's not on.
There you
For that one? Oh, it's on that one. Okay. I want to thank you so much. This was so full. And it will be hard to take back the full information that you've given us. But I do have a question.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you have any notions of how restorative justice might work in the United States, like it was in South Africa. I go blank when I think about what that would look like.
I hesitate, not because I don't have a vision of restorative justice at work. I'm not in control, I'm just standing here. All right, thank you. I think restorative justice is in the eye of the victim. What those, in order to, restorative justice looks like asking those who have been harmed what needs to happen in order for the harm to stop? What needs to happen for you to believe that your humanity has been restored? And then do that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Is there a question here?
When I read all 25 of those things to follow for the one community, sometimes it saddens me because a lot of those things we did, it would make a lot of entities poorer. There are businesses that benefit from the opposite of all those things, and governments and all sorts of things. So it's almost like we're being pushed back every material stuff. You know, why, if people started treating each other with love, they wouldn't buy so much crap. Seriously.
Thank you for that observation.
Sir?
I think the challenge. No, please come to the microphone as I attempt to respond to that astute observation. I would say that the challenge is there was a time when corporations were not people, and that people were like the folks in Rome. You know, the folks in your neighborhood. Those were the people. I think we've come to a time, though, that this capitalist enterprise is being seen for what it is. That is to benefit corporations, to benefit those at the top. And the rest of us are pawns on their chessboard, no matter who we are. We're merely pawns on the chessboard of capitalism. If we remember one of the earlier slides, it talked about the pillars of white supremacy. Slavery and capitalism. It is a fallacy that we all learned in elementary school that America is a democracy. That's not true. One vote, one person, one vote does not give us election results. If you're looking at the presidential election, it's not one person, one vote. Our system is run on capitalism that is built, that is established in order to create an upper class of white men who control the corporations and everything that the corporations provide for us. Some of which has to be provided through the government, and some now through those government as well. Follow the money, people. Yes.
To add to that, there's a comment Bernie made that we do have socialism in this country. It's just socialism for the rich.
We're going to have to.
The second thing, well, I remember it doesn't need to be necessary for restorative justice as in South Africa, where the situation got to a point where it could not continue the way it was.
There are many people in this country today who say the situation does not continue the way it was. The difference is we are not believed.
How many of us have to be believed?
I don't know.
Exactly.
I think if those who share our beliefs would come together, speak up, write up, vote up, then and buy up or down. You know, boycotting is still, I think, can be a very effective strategy.
When do we reach a tipping point?
We have to. I'm sorry, sir.
I don't know. I wish I was in charge.
Yeah, exactly. How many of you are registered to vote? If you haven't raised your hand, you know what you can do first thing. All right? Now, to follow up, you have opportunities. These are called the Racial Monologue Stories from Our Community, March 2nd at 7 p.m. at the Unitarian Universalist Congregation on Pine Brook. Here's a chance to hear personal stories. Relationship, we heard. Here's your opportunity to do that. Now, one of the areas that we heard somewhat in one of our previous presentations was the issue of anti-Semitism. March the 4th, that's Wednesday, 7 p.m. at the Jewish Congregation of Venice. There is a program on the Book of Esther, confronting hatred in the Jews. A very important topic today. We see it in the news and everywhere else. It's just part of the same deal, just a different section of the other. Right? So, last year you heard individuals. You heard experts. They said if you see something, do something. This year you heard from specific areas within our community. Education, the environmental system, the criminal justice system. We went in deeper into each one of these, and they were pointed out areas. So if you've been here, and many of you haven't been through all of them, you are packed with information. Tonight, in a way, we got a summation of much of that with really good phrases and statements to use to our friends, our neighbors, our faith communities, wherever you are. I would encourage you, don't be quiet. Have a civil conversation. We can do that. Turn off the damn television and have a conversation with someone about something important, which is where we are. So